Hello again, everyone. Welcome to our online survey masterclass, Do's and Don'ts of Interactive Questions. A few logistical notes before we get started. You'll see two different ways to communicate with us throughout the webinar, the chat box and the Q&A box. Please use the chat box for all technical issues and the Q&A box for any questions related to the content of the webinar. With that, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Aaron Jew, our Research Director at Focus Vision. Aaron has over 15 years worth of full service online survey research and is responsible for providing research support and helping clients to stay at the forefront of market research trends, best survey design practices, and maximizing data insights. At this time, Aaron is going to turn off his camera and get started. Take it away, Aaron.
Thank you, Rachel. Thanks for that introduction. And thanks everybody for joining me on this presentation. I'm very delighted to be here today, and I do hope I can provide some information and learnings that will be invaluable to your research and invaluable and for you in terms of your knowledge and how to use and employ interactive questions in your online surveys. Here's how I'll be breaking down the agenda for the presentation. I'm going to touch first on the two items there as a way to introduce interactive questions. What are they? And how are they being used in surveys today? Then I'll go into a little bit about what experimental research has shown us about interactive questions. We've done some custom research, custom experiments, as well as I have plenty of anecdotal examples to show you and how interactive questions have been employed and some pitfalls, some benefits that we've discovered from them, and what we've learned in terms of the do's and don'ts. And then in the last section, I'll talk about some best practices guidelines in terms of where and how we should employ interactive questions to help us get the most out of our surveys. Okay, so what are interactive questions? What do we mean when we use that term? When we think about traditional surveys and traditional question type for our online surveys, we're talking about HTML-based forms, specifically the radio buttons, which are used for single select questions, and checkboxes, which are used for multi-select questions, or where you want the respondents to select all that applies for your particular question. Now, interactive questions, they're different. Not only do they look and feel different from the traditional HTML forms, but the underlying technology also differs in terms of, with interactive questions, these employ more advanced scripting like HTML5 and JavaScript. So here's an example of an interactive question as a rank sort type, where the user can drag and drop the various visuals or the picture icons to indicate rank order or what are their most top 3 preferred mobile games here in this example. And as you can see, this type of format provides a much more visual and interactive way for the respondent to engage with the survey. Not just a point and click task, but now it's a drag and drop task, and you see the neat visuals and the animation there. Here are 2 other examples. We have a slider at the top where the user can click or drag the position of the slider to indicate an answer choice. Below that is a button rating type question. And this is interactive too, although it is mostly a point and click task. As you hover over the different points in the scale, the colors animate or change. So in that way, it is more visually dynamic or interactive in terms of responding to the survey respondents' movement or interactions with the surveys. Here are more examples. An interactive question type can also get more sophisticated, not just a replacement or an alternative to a traditional form, HTML form, but they can be more complex and provide new ways to collect data, like a virtual magazine where a survey respondent can flip through pages of a content or a magazine, so we can test things like brand recall in print advertising, or an image map, a heat map to indicate what parts of a concept that the respondents may like or dislike. Interactive questions, we typically think of having a number of uses or purposes or benefits, shall we say. We use interactive questions for capturing information and data in a way that can't be done with traditional forms, like radio buttons and checkboxes, like the previous slide that I showed with the virtual magazine and the heat map. A dial test is another popular question type or interactive question, where you really need that kind of multimedia interactive interface to capture people's feedback as they watch a video or to show up areas of a print ad that they like or dislike. Another use of interactive questions is to replace the traditional forms, the HTML forms. If we're looking at ways to improve respondent engagement, enhance survey usability, we might use an interactive question. Not only do they look more attractive, they react or respond to the user. So if you think about the button rating question that I showed an example of, subtle things or animation and changes in color can provide a sort of responsive feedback that can help the user engage better with the survey, enhance survey usability compared to static forms. The interactive questions here on this slide use color and images and certainly look a lot more fun and interesting. But just to point out, you'll notice that here, you couldn't do what these interactive questions here accomplish, you couldn't also do with a simple checkbox and radio button form. So the first one is just really a grid question. The middle one is a single select rating scale, and the far left one is obviously a gender question. So these just look a little fancier, and we would therefore hope that they would help with respondent engagement. Here's a rank order tasks. The traditional way to do this is with number input if you're using traditional HTML-based forms. But if we have the drag and drop interactive question and have people place brands and rank in the rank buckets, this provides a more intuitive and user-friendly interface. Rather than inputting numbers, people can visually see and stack the rank order of their preferred brands. And so this example of an interactive question, it's going to be a more intuitive and a way to indicate the preferred choice for the games and really enhance survey usability. Here's a pick list task. Again, a lot more intuitive and closer to the real world, what we do to choose our favorite product out of a lineup if we have a shelf test, which I'm showing here on the right side of the slide, rather than having a list of texts, a pick list, if you will, where you have to read all the text and then just select one of the items there to indicate your most preferred using a radio button. So examples there of interactive questions intended to improve engagement and survey usability, and by extension, get us better data and a deeper connection to consumer opinions. But one of the things that we found is, one of the challenges that we found with interactive questions is that because of the technology, we can design these questions however we want in many ways. As you go from programmer to programmer, or even from technology vendor or technology platform to one platform to another, interactive questions are going to be executed in different ways or a little bit differently. You can see on this particular slide, I have 4 different versions of a slider. And so the question becomes, is there a right way to do this? Is there a wrong way to do this? Where should we put the start position of our slider? Are there going to be color effects or biases if we can include a picture? Or do these things even matter? So one of the things that we faced right away about using interactive questions and employing interactive questions in our survey is how do we use them properly to make the most out of our research, to get the most out of our data, so we can take advantage of the benefits of interactive questions? What are the things to avoid so that we can use interactive questions without compromising our data quality? And at Focus Vision, we've done some experiments on interactive questions, including custom research, as well as taking a look at, I trolled through some of our client projects that have used interactive questions to see how they work, where respondents may be dropping out and why. We've also spent a lot of time seeing how these can be used and designed for to make mobile-friendly surveys, and what the benefits there are there in terms of being able to customize the question for that particular user set of mobile users, and making designing questions to really be optimized for the smaller screen. We've also done some experiments on sliders, and we've learned quite a bit of things about how to use sliders and what best practices are for that, employing sliders in your surveys. So I'd like to share some of the lessons that we've learned from our experiments, and some anecdotal examples as well of interactive questions that I've seen and how I've seen them used over the years. Okay, first, mobile surveys. One of the things we track every year are the devices that our respondents are using to access Decipher surveys. Across our client projects, the left chart shows what we're seeing, the share of online starts for each of the three major devices: desktop, smartphone, and tablet. And obviously, as you can see here, smartphone growth or access to online surveys via smartphones have been accelerating over the years, while access of surveys through desktops has been slowing down. I don't think this should be a surprise to anyone, as we are increasingly, or already are, very much a mobile world, a mobile culture. One of the issues with this is that smartphone users also have the lowest participation rates or completion rates. On any given survey, someone coming through a survey on a smartphone can be 1.5 to 2 times more likely to drop out or abandon the survey midway through compared to a desktop user. And in the right chart, you can see what survey completion rates are for each of the three major devices. And in 2013 and 2014, there was a pretty wide gap there. But completion rates for smartphones began to catch up shortly after that. And a lot of that improvement had to do with the technology and more focus and attention being paid to mobile users and creating mobile-friendly surveys. And certainly at Focus Vision, especially around 2013, 2014, we were especially paying attention to how our platform was rendering, and making sure that we were a very mobile-focused, mobile-first type of platform. So you see that improvement in completion rates for smartphones in 2016 and 2017, where the gap has significantly shrunk. So the problem with mobile surveys, and we'll get to this will kind of lead us to the solution of how to improve dropout rates for mobile users. The challenge with mobile surveys is they aren't always properly designed for the smaller screen, or nor do they render well. Text is too small, input areas are too small, and this results in a poor survey experience. And we can use interactive questions to create mobile-friendly forms. And so larger scale labels, bigger input areas, and things like this are suitable for touch input on the smaller screen device. And here's an example of what I'm talking about. So on the left side, not mobile optimized, not mobile friendly, but if we enlarge the input areas, create a button rating type interactive question, this is a lot more mobile friendly and mobile optimized. And we've done experiments like these where we tested non-optimized version of a non-mobile optimized version of a survey versus a mobile optimized version of a survey, and we've had very good success with these. Here's another example, a traditional grid on the left, an interactive question on the right. The type of interactive question on the right, we call this a card sort, and these work really well on mobile devices. The card sort is an alternative to a grid where one attribute statement is shown at a time, and when an answer choice is selected, the next attribute statement automatically slides across the screen, and replaces the previous statement. So showing one statement at a time instead of a grid layout gives you more real estate to expand input areas and the font size of the text. It just really makes it more user-friendly and usable for people coming in on the mobile devices or the smaller screens. So these are just two examples of some of the things that we can use interactive questions for to transform an entire survey on a mobile device and make it more touch input friendly and friendly for the smaller screen. And like I said, these work out really well. The experiments that we've done comparing non-mobile friendly using just traditional HTML forms versus a very mobile friendly survey using interactive questions. These work out really well to improve usability and participation among mobile survey respondents. Specifically, what we've found is having a mobile-friendly survey using interactive questions, we can improve the dropout rate by as much as 50% among smartphone users. It can have a modest improvement in reducing failures on trap questions, as well as reducing straight line ticking in grids. And lastly, it can have significant improvement in survey enjoyment. So when we ask people to rate, well, how much did they enjoy this survey versus one on a mobile phone where we're just using HTML forms, we do have significant improvement in perceived survey enjoyment. So all these things, I think most people would agree with are very positive benefits for interactive questions. So one of the things that we'll want to have clarity on, we're using interactive question, we're changing the question type or the way the question is structured and how the type of task that we're asking the user to do is what did that do to our data? That's all great to use a card sort question instead of a traditional grid for improving response rates and completion rates, but how will that impact my data? What we found that yes, when you fundamentally alter the structure of the question, this is going to create a difference in the data. And we probably shouldn't be too surprised here. If you're going to change the way you ask the question, you're probably going to get a different answer. So comparing a card sort interactive question to a traditional grid, these are two different structures. That is, instead of seeing the statements all at once, like in a grid, you're going to see them one at a time. The statements being evaluated where one statement slides across the screen after an answer choice is selected. So there's going to be a difference there where also you see the scale goes from negative to positive with a traditional grid. The scale now vertical, going from positive to the negative direction. So we're altering the fundamental structure of the question type and the way it's structured here. So we are going to see the difference in data. And specifically with this card sort example, what we've found that there's a little bit of a data bias toward the middle of a scale compared to a traditional grid. It's tough, and we weren't really able to see in our determine in our experience whether there's anything wrong with that. In fact, we can't really know for sure which version provide better or more reliable or valid data. We just know that the two types of questions will yield slightly different results here. In contrast, when we are not really changing the fundamentals of the question structure, it doesn't seem to matter much to your data. So, for example, in this illustration I have here on the slide, if we go from a traditional radio button, single select rating scale to a mobile optimized design where we're really enlarging the input areas, adding a little bit of color, increasing the font size, we're pretty much, the structure of both versions are similar, where you have the same scale length, scale direction. The position of the input areas are pretty much the same. And it's still a point and click task, and that's all it is. And what we found in cases like this is that the data distribution of the result, the resulting data is pretty similar between both versions and not really significantly different. Just to show you some results comparing the two versions. There's a data table on the right here where I'm showing the gap or the difference between the interactive version, button style version versus the traditional HTML version. And you can see the gap, the difference between the data, whether you're on a smartphone and tablet, not a whole lot of difference there. Okay, just moving on to another experiment that we did on sliders. And I want to share with you what we found there and what we were trying to accomplish and understand regarding how to use sliders. So what we're trying to do here was compare sliders versus traditional radio buttons, looking at performance on desktop, tablet, and smartphone devices. We wanted to vary the start position of the slider because this is obviously something in the air, something that you can change. That when a respondent encounters a slider in the survey, you can have the start position be on the outside. It can be on the left. Or if you think that might bias responses toward the left, then you might start it in the middle. So where should we put the start position of the slider? So the charts here on this slide show what the results of our test was. And we have data for each of the 3 different major devices here. And the charts report the mean overall satisfaction on 5-point scale, just aggregating the 5-point scales that we had throughout the surveys. When the slider started at each of the various positions, in addition here, the charts show the control measure, the mean satisfaction score when the traditional radio button question type was used. There's some fluctuation and noise in the data, but what we found is slider start position has the most impact on mean scores for touch input devices. So just looking at the first 2 charts for smartphone and tablet devices, when the slider started on the right side, mean satisfaction scores spiked up, corresponding to a right-leaning bias for the positive end of the 5-point scale. And you don't see that right-leaning bias for desktop users. So what this reflects is a propensity among touch input users to give what we called passive responses, where people would just see the slider start position on the right side and leave it there. So we still have more investigation to do on this, but the results here might suggest the start position of the slider is best on the center or the outside of the slider. So because starting on the left probably wouldn't be advised in the case that the expected mean of the rating scale leaned on the left side of the scale. So our examples we tested, the expected mean of the rating scale leaned on the right sides, because typically people tend to give more positive responses. So there was a bias among touch input users to give passive responses to the right side of the scale. But what if you had a question where the expected mean was on the left side of the scale? So if you started the start position of the slider on the left side of the scale, there might very well be a left-leaning bias among touch input users. So seems to be here, the results of our experiment suggest that the start position of the slider would be best either on the outside of the scale or in the middle of the scale. We tested how sliders perform for objective measures. So we didn't find any bias for that, for capturing continuous objective measure. So here we asked for factual information rather than an opinion. How many miles did you travel with your car? And comparing the slider to numeric input, we found no main difference between the 2 versions. So just to summarize our work on the sliders, they are sensitive to start position, especially for touch devices, and data from objective measures was very comparable to the traditional numeric text input question type. In terms of what question types respondents preferred, as people went through the survey, whether they were in the cell using sliders or whether they were in the experimental cell using just the traditional HTML forms. What we found is desktop users stated a preference for the traditional radio buttons over sliders. But when you ask a mobile user, they're generally accepting of whatever question type they encountered. So if they went through the survey using radio button, they liked that better than the slider. If the survey treatment they went through with the one with the slider, they said they preferred that form better than a radio button. So, in terms of survey experience or survey enjoyment, asking people to rate their overall survey experience on an 11-point scale, not much difference showed up whether you went through the survey using the slider or radio button. And this was true for all devices. So our bottom line was we think that sliders could offer an alternative over text input. Smartphone users might find it easier to use a slider rather than pull up the virtual keyboard to input a number on their smartphone. But otherwise, if you're simply using a slider to replace what can already be done with the traditional radio button, I don't think there's a compelling reason to do so. Okay, so 2 points that I want to make, and the things that I've just talked about, and the discussion on the experiments that we've done with interactive question is yes, they can be beneficial to improving respondent engagement and participation. For mobile users, we see the unique designs and the flexibilities offered there allow us to customize the question to the specific needs and not based of survey takers, the smaller screen. But on the other hand, like with the slider and varying the start position of the sliders, interactive questions give us increased options for how we can customize and design them. And these changes can make a difference in ways we may not always understand. So one of the things that I've done over the years is not only troll through surveys hosted on the Decipher survey platform, paying close attention to when our clients are using interactive questions and how they perform, but also doing little mini experiments and gathering anecdotal evidence on how interactive questions are being used and what sort of problems and benefits we are able to get out of them. Oops. And so I'd like to show you some examples of that, and there's some lessons here to learn in terms of what not to do. And largely because interactive questions really open the door in terms of how we can design these things. The technology aspect of interactive questions can move much faster than our understanding of how they work or whether they're even good for us. There are just so many possibilities, not just colors, how these things are arranged, what type of animation we want to put on it. So interactive questions can be good for us, but our particular design for a slider might not work out so well or not the way we intended. So here's an example of something that we thought was very simple, and it turned out to have an unintended consequence that we didn't realize when we first developed this form. On the left, we have a traditional checkbox type question, and on the right, we have an interactive button box question. And this seemed like a very good alternative for touch input devices. Well, when we tested this and compared the two, it turned out respondents tend to select more items when we use the checkbox form compared to the version on the right. And what probably happened here, what likely happened was when we tested these two, the check mark from the checkboxes provide the traditional visual cue of being a multi-select question, but no such visual cue existed with the buttons here, so fewer items got selected. With interactive questions, I've also seen color biases. In the bottom example, we found that there was a data bias away from the negative end of the scale compared to the testing it to the neutral colored scale, like the one above. And quite possibly what happened here was the strong hue of the red may have been aggressive or too strong looking, just shying people away from that. Here we have a situation where the interactive question was just poorly designed. And in this example, we had a series of sliders, and this was set up to be a constant sum type question, but half of the rows were hidden below the fold of the screen. And also respondents couldn't see the calculated sum at the bottom when they were moving the slider in the first few rows. So a bit of scrolling up and down was required to make this work and to get through this particular exercise, which made it very hard for respondents, creating a lot of frustration. And what we saw here when this question was encountered, there was a pronounced increase in survey dropouts. So poor design for interactive questions is obviously going to lead to dropout. I've also seen some cross-platform issues come up. So more typically, we are sensitive nowadays to how our survey elements are going to show up on a mobile device and on the smaller screen because we all want our surveys to be mobile, smartphone friendly. But designs for the smaller screen don't always scale up well to the desktop PC device. So here, where wide buttons worked well on our smartphone, and we thought these would make a very, very good survey to have buttons. They were overly large and intrusive on the desktop screen. So we found this kind of layout triggered increased respondents dropout for desktop users compared to using just HTML forms. So those are some of the pitfalls, and things, and I wanted to share with you with interactive questions. So yeah, we may think interactive question may be a great thing, more engaging, more fancy, more compelling for our survey respondents, but we do have to be careful in how we employ them because there are just so many often things because we have the design elements and ways we can customize interactive questions. All of these little modifications and things you can do with them haven't really been necessarily fully tested and borne out. So what I want to try to do is tie everything together and provide some takeaways from the experiments and learnings we've done over the years at Focus Vision with interactive questions. And I think interactive questions can be good tools for improving survey engagement and usability. We just need to pay close attention on how we execute them to avoid some of the pitfalls. And also, you want to be able to make sure that they're going to provide a very strong benefit for you to outweigh any disadvantages that there might be with interactive questions. So I think there are 4 areas to concentrate on when we think about interactive questions and best practices for incorporating them in our surveys. First, we should focus on clear benefits. How is this interactive question going to improve my survey experience? Ideally, you want to have a reason beyond the cosmetic aspect of the interactive question. Should be something more than just, these interactive questions make my survey look prettier. Secondly, make sure the respondents will know what you expect of them. When you put an interactive question in a survey, you might be introducing new forms, a new type of survey task that the respondent may not be familiar with. So it needs to be very clear. The interactive question needs to be very clear in terms of what's the appropriate way to answer or interact with it. Then be consistent with the question type you do use, as using different ones may result in differences in your data. And then finally, test and retest your survey, not only to ensure your interactive question functions properly, but also to ensure it renders well and it's easy to use across the 3 major devices, desktop, tablet, and smartphones. So here's an example of a clear benefit and purpose for using an interactive question, using a card sort as an alternative to a grid format question type. That's going to render as more usable on a mobile device. So there's a clear benefit to doing it this way versus having a large grid question. If we have a large grid question that we need to ask, it's a card sort would be a preferable type of question type on a mobile device. Another example of a clear benefit and purpose for using interactive questions is if you need to capture data in a way that goes beyond the radio buttons and checkboxes. for example, a dial test. The only way to do this is with an interactive question, so by all means, we need to do that. Use interactive questions when there's a clear usability benefit. The self-test is going to be more intuitive to the respondent here because that mimics what we do in our real lives when we go shopping at a pharmacy. And it's a lot easier for us to comprehend an array of images than a list of text in terms of being a more efficient and user-friendly type of task for the respondent. Similarly for a rank sort question, the act of sorting cards is a much more intuitive and efficient task for someone to get through instead of typing in a number. So having a clear benefit or a concrete purpose about what you're trying to achieve like this when using an interactive question, that's really going to help keep you focused in creating something that will result in a more positive outcome. Sometimes, as I'm saying, we might think of it, the benefit of interactive questions is that they look visually compelling and they look cool. And I would argue that this in itself, while this in itself could have the potential to engage respondents and improve survey enjoyment, these are tricky because the designs, if you're creating interactive questions where your design is driven by creative direction and less so for a functional purpose, putting too much focus on being splashy and cool it could very well mean the respondent may pay attention to the splashy and cool thing rather than the careful and honest feedback that you want. So in the slider, you may have seen this version of a slider where the face gets bigger, the smile gets bigger at the positive end of the slider and turns to a frown when you move to the negative end of the slider. What we found in this particular situation is that there's actually a data bias toward the two endpoints of this scale because what we probably think is going on with this question type and the way this particular slider is designed is that respondents will use this question type, move the slider up and down to see the animation, and then just leave it there. So, we do want to tread carefully with interactive questions. We want to be clear when using interactive questions. What is the task? What the respondent needs to do? And I showed this example earlier. We need to build the interactive question so it's immediately apparent how the interactive question is to be used without reading text or instructions ideally. So, with this example, there was uncertainty around the button boxes, whether it was a multi-select or a single select form. Well, we can make that very clear by visually showing the check marks when a choice is selected. And then be consistent when using interactive questions. As I pointed out, if your interactive question is fundamentally different in design from a traditional radio button or checkbox, don't be surprised to see data discrepancies as well. So consistency is important with how you set up and display or label your interactive question. Make sure you do it in the same way. If you start your slider position in the middle, be consistent about that so you can make the appropriate interpretation for your data. A lot of times as researchers, we're analyzing relative differences in our data, so changes between waves, differences between brands or attributes, and consistency in the data collection process is the only way we can really do this type of analysis. And then lastly, test and retest your survey. Make sure it renders well across devices. Test for functionality, readability, clarity, and performance. And this is something all of us are capable of doing. If a survey doesn't work right or look right for you, it's not going to work right for the respondent either. That concludes my presentation. I hope this gives you a deeper sense of the do's and don'ts of interactive questions. Certainly, they can be a benefit for improving survey usability and participation, giving us new ways to collect data and consumer insights. But there are also things to watch out for, especially since the technology has given us such wide flexibility in what we can do with these. Interactive questions can be easy to abuse or misuse. So with that, I think we can open it up now to questions if there are any.
Great, Aaron, thank you so much. That was a great presentation. At this time, we're going to open the floor for Q&A. Please use the Q&A box to type in your questions, and we'll give everyone a few minutes to do so. So go ahead. A lot of questions have just come in, so let's get started so that we have time to answer quite a few. Aaron, the first one, can you talk more about your thoughts on using interactive questions for a tracking study?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Obviously, with tracking and having a successful tracker, consistency is one of the most critical elements, so that you don't compromise your ability to to make your historical comparisons and have your trend lines there. One of the things that I've found, one of the things that occasionally comes up is especially with the technology differing from one platform to another. Some of you may be running trackers for not just a couple of years, but 5 years or 10 years, making sure that the interactive questions that you employ, you're going to be able to think about when the technology being consistent from, especially over the years, if you decide technology improves or you move from one vendor to another, you're going to be able to make that apples comparison, because one platform may have one version of a slider if you have that in your tracker, and another platform, if you move over, might have another version of the tracker. So I have occasionally had situations where clients come over to our platform from another competing platform, and they need to replicate the exact look and feel of their particular tracker to maintain consistency with the historical comparisons. And that particular situation, it does take a fair bit of time and resources and custom development to replicate the look and feel of the previous platform or technology that they were using. So that's just something to keep in mind there when using interactive questions, and the technology or the way you've designed it or the way you've used it in the past. It may not be so easy to be consistent and replicate later on.
Great, thank you so much. Another one that just came through, what advice would you give for someone wanting to build a survey entirely of all interactive questions?
So obviously, some of the things that I had talked about in terms of consistency, I think creating a survey entirely of interactive questions, you want to keep it relatively simple. Don't go crazy. Don't put in a hodgepodge or a mix of too many interactive questions, because that can break the flow. Perhaps make it a little bit too confusing to respondents if you jump around from one question type to another, or one interactive question to another. So my suggestion there might be to select perhaps a handful of interactive question types and be consistent about how you employ them. So let's say for all the single select questions, you use a button form. For all your grid type questions, you use the card sort question. You don't want to mix it up and have like a slider or a star rating and a card sort question for each of their 3 different grids, and that just become very confusing for respondents to go through, because it really interrupts the flow and consistency of the survey.
Wonderful. Looks like we have time for maybe 3 more questions, so I'll take this one. Do you have any concerns with using more visual or dynamic questions, considering some respondents may have unstable or slow internet connections?
Yeah, that certainly is a possibility, especially for large images. Many interactive questions contain embedded images which are very, very small. like 1 kilobyte. And in most situations, that's completely acceptable, even for people on a smartphone device using a mobile network, and that's really not an issue so much. It's just when you're using an interactive question, just keep in mind the file sizes of the images that are being employed there. And of course, if you're doing an international study or a study in developing countries, obviously connection speeds are going to be a little bit more spotty there, so you have to be careful with employing interactive questions in that particular case.
Have you considered ADA compliance with these interactive question designs?
Yes, that's a good point. That's not a particular area that I've studied or thought about a whole lot, but certainly that can be a consideration. I can imagine, like with sliders or even drag and drop, doing that kind of task on a smaller screen, with people with maybe the elderly, or if you have big fingers like I do, that may be a little tough compared to a more simple point and click task. So certainly if your target audience or you're running a study where there may be particular concern with that, perhaps you want to be very careful about using the interactive question and maybe stick to more of the traditional HTML form. Because certainly nowadays, in HTML forms, checkboxes and radio buttons have, we can design them in such a way that may be able to accommodate your particular situation if you have specific needs there.
Great, and it looks like we have time for one more. Are these things that, I'm sorry, how do you handle randomization in an image-based self-test?
I'm not quite sure how to answer that question. I know that is possible for us without more of a technical, I guess that would be more of a technical or programming issue in terms of how you would rearrange things on the shelf and display them. And so I imagine that that's something that we can certainly set up and develop with the type of shelf test that we have in terms of the arrangement and where the particular images for your product or whatever it is you're trying to test should go on the shelf.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It looks like we've reached the end of our time together. Thank you for joining us for our online survey masterclass, do's and don'ts of interactive questions. And thank you so much to our presenter, Aaron Ju, for a wonderful and informative presentation today. If there were any questions that did not get answered today, don't worry, we'll follow up soon. Or you can contact us at webinars@focusvision.com and we will respond to your question at that time. We hope to see you at future webinars. Have a great day.
Thank you.